The moment I saw little Timmy sprinting down the street like his shoes were on fire screaming snakes, I knew something had gone horribly wrong. He wasn't the dramatic type either. That kid once stepped on a hornet and just shrugged it off. But now he was wailing like the world was ending and pointing at my shed like it had just coughed up the devil himself. I dropped my grocery bags and ran toward it. The door was wide open, which was a huge problem considering what was supposed to be locked inside. Just as I reached the shed, I nearly tripped over a stack of plastic storage bins, none of which were mine. And then I saw her. Karen, HOA president, neighborhood menace, holding a clipboard and proudly telling 2 HOA members that the shed was now officially repurposed for community storage. I froze. Behind her I saw one of my albino corn snakes leisurely slithering across the top shelf of the incubator rack and another disappearing under a box labeled seasonal decorations. You know that moment in movies when a scientist screams you open Pandora's box and no one listens? Yeah, that was me. I didn't even need to yell though, because seconds later a snake poked its head out from behind a wreath and one of the board members screamed like he'd been tossed. Karen waved it off, saying it's fake, probably left over from Halloween. Then the other board member screamed and bolted out. Karen turned to see a curious garter snake coiled halfway up her clipboard. That's when she screamed too. I stormed forward, grabbed the clipboard, and said through clenched teeth, "You broke into a federally licensed reptile facility." Karen blinked confused and tried to regain her composure. She said it was an unused building, and as HOA president I have authority to reassign idle community structures. I asked her what community structure she thought this was because I bought and built the shed myself. She smugly replied that it was placed within visual range of common space, and therefore technically under her purview. I tried hard to remain calm, but my hands were already shaking with a cocktail of rage and panic. Not just because Karen had trespassed. Not just because she broke into my private shed and threw in God knows how many dusty fake Christmas trees and broken plastic snowmen. No, what terrified me was that she had disturbed 3 breeding trays of eggs, 1 temperature-sensitive heating system, and 2 enclosures holding mildly venomous research snakes. Snakes that if stressed would not hesitate to bite. They weren't killers, but a bite could cause swelling, dizziness, and a trip to the ER. And I was supposed to be monitoring them every 3 hours. Karen, meanwhile, was still shouting to the neighborhood that she had discovered an illegal snake dungeon in our midst. A few people had gathered by then, curious mostly, but her words carried fast. One teenager started recording with their phone. I stepped into the shed, carefully retrieved the garter snake, and placed it back into the safety tank. I checked the incubator. The heat levels had dropped. That could ruin the clutch. My entire research for the month was now compromised. I took a deep breath and looked back at her. "You've just committed felony trespass on a state-sanctioned wildlife conservation facility." That's when she said the magic phrase, "Prove it." I went back to my house, grabbed the paperwork. Federal licenses, Department of Wildlife partnership agreements, and an HOA boundary survey proving the shed was fully within my property line. I held them up to her face like a badge. She barely glanced at them before snorting and saying snakes are not allowed under HOA guidelines, they're pests. I told her these snakes were listed under protected status and part of a breeding program for endangered species. She rolled her eyes and said she'd talk to legal. Then she had the audacity to smile at me and walk away, leaving behind her storage bins, her clipboard, and a shed full of panicked reptiles. I spent the rest of that day cleaning up the chaos. 2 of the snakes had slipped out and curled under the heat mat wiring. One had started laying eggs prematurely due to the sudden drop in environmental control. I managed to stabilize the situation, but it was too late for one of the hatchlings. It didn't survive the shock. That night I sat in the living room staring at my empty coffee mug, thinking about how something so absurd had turned so dangerous so fast. My work wasn't just a quirky hobby. I was collaborating with the state's Ecological Conservation Unit on snake population rehabilitation. The shed had temperature and humidity sensors, air filtration, a quiet water misting system, and 2 years of my life poured into its design. And Karen had just barged in like it was her personal attic. I didn't want to go full nuclear yet. I figured maybe I could talk to the rest of the HOA board members, privately show them the documents, explain the seriousness of the situation, and prevent this from spiraling. But the next morning I got an email with the subject line HOA emergency violation, and when I opened it there it was in bold black letters, HOA demands immediate removal of all snakes and hazardous animals from shared facilities. Attached to the email was a photo of Karen standing in front of my shed, holding one of my baby snakes like it was a venomous cobra, and pointing at it dramatically. The caption underneath read, "Look what we found in our shared shed." I stared at that photo for a long moment. Not just because it was absurd, but because the look on Karen's face wasn't fear. It was satisfaction. Like she believed she'd finally caught me doing something wrong. Like she wanted to win. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a shed or HOA rules, or even about snakes. This was about power. And Karen had just declared war on the wrong guy. Because if she thought she could hijack my shed, my research, and my reputation without consequences, she clearly hadn't done her homework. And she definitely didn't know who I was. I wasn't just some backyard snake hobbyist. I was the lead ecological consultant for the state's Department of Wildlife, specializing in venomous reptile habitat stabilization. And I had a long memory, a deeper bench of legal contacts than she could imagine, and a folder of infrared security footage with her smug face caught red-handed. It was time to strike back. And I had just the plan. The next morning I was still seething as I reviewed the damage in my shed. The ambient temperature had dipped nearly 5 degrees overnight because the door had been left open too long. My heating system, designed to maintain specific microclimates for different snake species, was working overtime to recover. One of the lesser-known but highly sensitive desert king snakes had become lethargic, its metabolism likely thrown off. I made a mental note to schedule a full environmental rebalancing later that afternoon. Before I could even finish cleaning, I heard voices outside, too many voices. I peeked through the slats of the shed window and saw Karen back again, flanked by 2 HOA board members, her ever-present clipboard now replaced with a tablet and a megaphone. She had brought reinforcements this time. Dave and Carol, 2 equally pompous board members who seemed more interested in flexing imaginary authority than actually improving the neighborhood, were standing by the shed entrance, nodding along as Karen addressed the small gathering crowd. I stepped outside and stood silently behind the group, just in time to hear Karen declare this facility to be in breach of local community safety and aesthetic regulations and therefore subject to immediate inspection and repurposing. Her voice was nasal and self-righteous, the kind that could strip paint off a wall and still ask for applause. Dave walked into the shed, trying to look brave but practically tiptoeing around the floor like a nervous cat. Carol stood outside fanning herself like it was 100 degrees. The crowd was growing, half a dozen neighbors who clearly had nothing better to do. Karen noticed me and pointed. There he is. The reptile hoarder endangering our children. I raised my voice just enough to cut through the chatter. They're federally protected reptiles being bred for conservation and released into endangered ecosystems. Not pets. Not hoarding. And absolutely none of your business. But the damage was already underway. Dave had just tripped over the heat cable wire and accidentally dislodged a hatchling container. 3 baby corn snakes slithered free, causing immediate screams and chaos. One woman shrieked and jumped into a nearby bush. Another man dropped his iced coffee and backed away like the ground had turned to lava. Karen yelled something about calling animal control and ordered Dave to seal the shed door. I stepped forward fast and knelt down, gently collecting the hatchlings and placing them back in their enclosure. I looked up at Karen and spoke loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. You just disrupted a secure environment that took years to calibrate and days to recover after your last intrusion. Your actions have already resulted in 1 dead snake and now you've risked 3 more. This isn't just trespassing. It's biological sabotage. Karen rolled her eyes and said if these things are so important maybe they shouldn't be kept next to a family neighborhood. I stood up straight. That's exactly why they're here. This facility is one of 5 statewide labs testing human-wildlife coexistence strategies. And guess what, Karen, your behavior just became part of the case study. Her face twitched slightly and I could tell she didn't understand a word I had said, but she felt threatened by the tone. And then came the twist. One of the teenagers who had recorded yesterday's commotion uploaded the video to a local community forum where it had exploded overnight. A few neighbors had already seen it and were discussing in hushed tones what a disaster Karen had made of the whole situation. In the video you could clearly hear her say, "Just shove the decorations in there, it's probably just junk," followed by the now infamous clip of her screeching when a harmless milk snake slithered over her foot. Before Karen could regain control of the narrative, a familiar white truck pulled up and 2 uniformed officers from animal control stepped out. Karen straightened her blouse and approached them with her usual smug stride. "Thank goodness you're here. He's got venomous snakes hiding in this shed." The taller officer blinked slowly and then smiled. "We know. That's Dr. Ray Morton. We've worked with him for years. He trained us on how to handle high-stress relocations." Karen blinked and looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. The shorter officer continued, "We received a call about unlicensed interference with an active research site. That's a serious offense. We're here to assess the situation and secure the perimeter." Karen stammered, "I'm the HOA president. I have the right to repurpose shared space." The taller officer pulled a laminated boundary map from his folder and pointed. "According to this survey, this shed is well within Dr. Morton's private property. Your authority ends at the sidewalk." The crowd was now shifting noticeably. A few people stepped closer to me and started asking questions about the snake. Were they all safe? What kind were they? Would kids be allowed to visit one day? I answered patiently while the officers took statements and gathered evidence of property damage. Meanwhile, Karen was slowly backing away toward her house, fuming. As the officers left, I noticed one of them slip me a card. "Keep this just in case. If she escalates again, file a report directly through this line. It's fast-tracked for wildlife-related cases." I thanked them and returned to the shed, trying to refocus my mind on restoring environmental balance. But my phone buzzed again. It was a message from a local reporter. They had seen the video too, and wanted to do a human interest story on community conservation efforts. I almost laughed. Karen had intended to destroy my work and reputation, but instead had drawn attention and support I never asked for but now planned to use. That evening I watched as the HOA sent out an official email claiming they were unaware of the biological sensitivities involved and would investigate how the incident occurred. The wording was vague and pointedly avoided Karen's name. But the neighborhood wasn't fooled. That same video was now floating around on TikTok with the caption, "HOA Karen tries to evict snakes from science lab, fails miserably." I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down to draft my next move. If Karen wanted to weaponize HOA politics, I would bring science, law, and public opinion. She had stepped into my world, a world she didn't understand. And if she came back again, she'd find the snakes weren't the only ones ready to strike. 2 days after the animal control visit, Karen escalated her efforts like a woman possessed. If I thought she'd be embarrassed or back down after being publicly humiliated and corrected by professionals, I had clearly underestimated her capacity for denial and spite. Instead of retreating, she doubled down and launched a full-blown smear campaign. It started with glossy flyers distributed to every doorstep in the neighborhood. The title across the top screamed "Community Safety Alert" in bold red letters, and underneath was a heavily edited image of my shed with a snake photoshopped to look 10 times its actual size. The caption read, "Dangerous illegal snake den operating in our neighborhood." I picked one off my porch and stared at it in disbelief. The flyer listed a number of wild claims, including that my snakes had already bitten 2 children, that I was hoarding venomous reptiles in a makeshift zoo, and that I was being investigated by state authorities for animal trafficking. The lies were so extreme I might have laughed if I hadn't known how fast misinformation spreads, especially in a community that thrives on gossip. Some neighbors gave me side eyes that afternoon, clearly influenced by the propaganda. One woman clutched her toddler tightly while walking past my driveway. Another man muttered something under his breath as I unloaded groceries. Karen had weaponized fear and framed herself as the savior of suburban peace. Her emails to the HOA mailing list now had subject lines like emergency vote to revoke dangerous occupancy and petition to ban unauthorized wildlife structures. I received 3 emails in one day demanding I appear at the next HOA meeting to defend myself against formal removal of my shed. Meanwhile, she wasn't finished. Karen decided to sabotage me more directly. I had planned a weekend open house, something lighthearted to educate the neighborhood about what the snakes really were and how conservation efforts were designed to help, not harm, human communities. I even had harmless snakes prepared for display and a presentation scheduled with a guest herpetologist. The goal was to change the narrative and show everyone the truth, not Karen's twisted fiction. But early Saturday morning, as I walked toward the shed with some supplies, I noticed something strange on the grass. Plastic snakes, dozens of them, strewn in random places across my lawn and around the shed entrance, poorly hidden among bushes and flower pot. Someone had deliberately planted them to provoke panic. The absurd part? They were the cheap kind you'd buy at a dollar store, comically colored and completely unrealistic. Still, the implication was clear. She was trying to stage an incident that would spiral. Just then I spotted her across the street, standing on her porch with her arms folded, watching like a cartoon villain in yoga pants. She didn't even try to hide the smirk spreading across her face. But what Karen didn't know, or had forgotten in her haze of ego, was that I had surveillance cameras on the property, not just for security but to monitor wildlife movement and snake behavior. I reviewed the footage and there it was. Just past midnight, Karen and her cousin Dave sneaking onto my lawn with a bag full of plastic reptiles. They tiptoed around like a pair of toddlers playing spy. The footage showed her placing a particularly large rubber cobra at the base of the ramp and Dave dropping 2 neon green pythons on top of my rose bushes. The entire sequence looked so absurd it might have gone viral for comedy alone. But I wasn't laughing. I clipped the footage, saved it in 3 formats, and uploaded it to a secure drive. That evening, at the HOA emergency meeting, Karen strutted in like she was about to win an Oscar. She had her digital presentation ready, complete with fake images and dramatic music playing on a loop. She even printed testimonials from 2 neighbors who said they felt unsafe walking by my property. She waited for her moment and then pulled out a bag with 2 of the fake snakes. She held one up like a prosecutor holding a murder weapon and declared, "I found these this morning. Proof that our homes are being overrun." The board members murmured. A few attendees gasped. She turned to me with a smug expression and said, "Would you like to explain yourself?" I stood up and walked calmly to the front. Instead of responding with words, I plugged my laptop into the projector and played the footage. Silence fell. There was Karen on screen in grainy black and white, sneaking through my yard with a sack of rubber snakes like she was pulling off a low-budget heist. The room erupted. Someone snorted with laughter. Another woman said, "Oh my God," as she serious. Karen's face flushed beet red as she lunged toward the projector screaming, "That's fake, that's AI, that's not even me." I turned to the board and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "This footage is time-stamped, watermarked by my wildlife monitoring software, and stored on a secure federal research server. Anyone who wants to verify it is welcome to contact the Department of Wildlife." The president of the HOA, a normally quiet man named Greg, leaned forward and removed his glasses. "Karen," he said, "what were you thinking?" Her voice cracked as she tried to blame Dave, then claim the footage was manipulated, then say it was part of an artistic display. No one believed her. Greg looked exhausted as he said we'll revisit the issue of the shed after reviewing official boundary documents. But for now I'm recommending a motion to suspend Karen from all HOA leadership duties pending further investigation. That night I walked home feeling like the war had turned. The smear campaign had crumbled under the weight of Karen's own arrogance. But I knew she wouldn't give up just yet. She was too proud and too delusional to admit defeat. What she didn't know was that I had started gathering more than footage. I had begun building a legal case with the environmental attorney I consulted for the state. Karen had crossed not just neighborhood boundaries but legal ones, and if she wanted to keep playing games, she was going to learn just how serious the consequences could be. Because I wasn't just protecting my snakes anymore. I was protecting the truth. And I was ready for whatever came next. The fallout from the HOA meeting rippled through the neighborhood like a shockwave. For the first time since Karen had taken over the presidency, her grip on the community was slipping. The video of her planting fake snakes had spread fast, not just among residents but online too. Someone from the meeting had recorded the entire projector moment and uploaded it with a title that read HOA Karen Gets Caught on Night Vision Planting Fake Snake. It hit over 50,000 views by morning. And the comments weren't kind. Memes followed. One had Karen's face photoshopped on a cartoon snake saying I regulate danger. Another called her the snake queen of suburbia. While the internet laughed, Karen wasn't done. Humiliated but still clinging to her delusion of power, she tried to save face the only way she knew how, by making things worse. 3 days after the meeting, I got a letter. Not from the HOA this time, but from her lawyer. Or rather, someone claiming to represent her. The letter was typed in Comic Sans, printed on cheap paper, and full of legal-sounding nonsense. It accused me of public defamation, digital forgery, endangerment of the community, and failure to adhere to neighborhood decorum. It demanded I take down all videos and issue a written apology to Karen for misrepresenting her character. I read it twice just to be sure I wasn't missing something important, then laughed out loud. It was amateur hour in legal form. I forwarded it to my actual attorney, who responded within minutes saying tell her to bring it. What Karen didn't realize was that while she was digging her own hole, I had quietly been documenting every violation she'd committed since the first day she entered my property. That included trespassing, unauthorized use of a master key, interference with federally licensed breeding environments, and now attempted slander and harassment. I wasn't planning on just winning this fight. I was planning on ending it. My attorney filed a cease and desist order against Karen for trespassing, property interference, and endangering licensed wildlife. He also submitted paperwork initiating a lawsuit for damages, both to my research and my reputation. To support the case, I included temperature logs showing the environmental disruption, photos of damaged incubation trays, and medical logs from a veterinary herpetologist who had examined the snakes following Karen's interference. The paperwork was delivered to her house that Thursday, and for once, Karen didn't come outside to argue. Instead, her blinds stayed shut for 2 days straight. But that wasn't the only development. The state's Department of Wildlife had taken notice too. After the animal control report and the viral video, one of their senior officers called me directly to schedule a site visit. Not for an audit, but to recognize the shed as an official micro-research facility for endangered reptile development. They wanted to help fund additional environmental protections, including solar power upgrades and motion-activated climate regulation. I agreed immediately. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen's sabotage had actually pushed my project into a whole new tier of visibility. A week later, the court date arrived. It wasn't a full trial, just the initial hearing for the injunction. Karen showed up in a pink blazer, dark sunglasses, and what looked like freshly dyed hair, flanked by her cousin Dave, who was clearly there for moral support rather than legal insight. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense voice, called the case to order with a sigh. Karen's attorney, or maybe just someone pretending to be one, tried to claim the video footage was fabricated and insisted that my snakes posed a public danger. The judge asked for evidence. He offered none. My attorney presented everything: the boundary survey, license documentation, damage reports, even character references from 3 state officials. The judge watched the surveillance video in complete silence. When it ended, she looked directly at Karen and said, "Do you understand what tampering with a licensed wildlife facility entails?" Karen fumbled for words, mumbling something about not knowing it was a real facility. The judge raised an eyebrow and asked, "Then why did you bring a bag of fake snakes at midnight?" Karen paused, visibly shrinking under the weight of her own stupidity. The judge issued a temporary injunction barring Karen from setting foot within 50 feet of my shed, my driveway, or any property associated with my research. She also scheduled a formal hearing for the civil damages case and advised Karen to retain actual legal representation. As we left the courtroom, Dave tried to whisper something to Karen, but she snapped at him and marched off ahead, her heels clicking like angry punctuation. My attorney turned to me and said, "This is going to be easier than I thought." I went home feeling like a storm had passed, but part of me knew another was always possible. With people like Karen, pride doesn't die quietly. The neighborhood shifted over the next few days. People who had previously kept their distance now waved from their porches or asked friendly questions. One neighbor even dropped off a plate of cookies with a note that read, "Sorry for believing the crazy lady." Word spread that Karen had been suspended indefinitely from the HOA and that a new election was on the way. Several residents had already nominated a replacement. One of the frontrunners was Greg, who had quietly supported me during the chaos. Another surprising name was mine. I declined politely, citing conflict of interest given my research work. But I promised to help whoever took over to ensure something like this never happened again. Then came the unexpected twist. Karen returned one evening to collect her HOA boxes that she had initially stored in my shed. The same boxes she claimed were part of an emergency supplies initiative. She showed up with a dolly and a sour face, not saying a word. I watched from my porch as she wheeled one out and accidentally tipped it. A stack of HOA newsletters spilled everywhere, along with 3 glittery lawn flamingos and a broken megaphone. She scrambled to gather it all, muttering under her breath. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the dead hatchling, the fake flyers, the fake lawyer letter, and the absurd midnight invasion. She looked up, caught me watching, and muttered, "I'm not done." I said calmly, "I know. And I'm still recording." She stood there frozen for a beat, then wordlessly turned and loaded the last box into her SUV. As she drove off, a few neighbors watched from behind curtains. Everyone could feel it. The end was near. But not quite. Karen always had one last gasp. I just had to be ready when it came. By the time the civil damages hearing arrived, Karen had finally hired a real attorney. Or at least someone who wore a suit and didn't use Comic Sans. The courtroom was quieter than the first time. Fewer dramatics, no plastic snakes, no viral footage playing on loop. Just paperwork, arguments, and legal procedures. But that didn't mean it lacked tension. Karen sat with her arms folded, refusing to look in my direction. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had acted out of genuine concern for community safety and claimed that her actions, while perhaps overzealous, were not malicious. My attorney dismantled that defense in under 10 minutes. He presented the environmental data logs, the surveillance footage, the statement from the herpetologist, and the clear timeline of sabotage. The judge asked if Karen had any proof to support her claims. Her lawyer mumbled something about perception and public duty, but it fell flat. When the ruling came, it was firm and immediate. Karen was found liable for trespassing, harassment, property damage, and interference with federally licensed research. She was ordered to pay for the replacement of the incubators, compensatory damages for the loss of the hatchling cycle, legal fees, and an additional fine for endangering protected species. The total wasn't astronomical, but it was enough to sting. More importantly, it came with a permanent restraining order that barred her from any proximity to my shed or any future research facilities I might construct on my property. She stormed out of the courtroom with a look of disbelief, as if she still thought she'd win by just being louder. But the law doesn't care about volume. It cares about evidence, and I had all of it. After the ruling, the Department of Wildlife approved my grant application for facility expansion. With their help, I added a secure outer fence around the shed, solar-powered climate control systems, and new educational displays. I called the new section the Observation Zone, a small corner with reinforced glass walls where local schools could bring students to learn about conservation and reptile ecosystems. The local news did a full feature on it, calling it a groundbreaking example of suburban environmental integration. The footage showed smiling kids, fascinated teachers, and snakes coiled peacefully in their enclosures. I stood in the background, not trying to be the hero, just letting the work speak for itself. And then came the day Karen returned for her final act of disgrace. It was late evening, just after sunset, when motion alerts buzzed my phone. I checked the camera feed and there she was, sneaking across the side yard with a flashlight and what looked like a crowbar. It was almost surreal, watching her skulk like a cartoon burglar in flip-flops and a sweatshirt. I called the police immediately and activated the audible security warning installed during the upgrade. A pre-recorded voice blared warning, protected wildlife facility. You are trespassing. Karen froze like a deer in headlights. I watched as she turned to run but tripped over a hose and landed in a freshly mulched flower bed. By the time the police arrived, she was covered in dirt and still trying to explain that she thought she left something important inside. The officer on duty didn't even bother pretending to believe her. They escorted her off the property and cited her for violating the restraining order. I didn't even have to go outside. The camera footage was clear. The officer gave me a thumbs up through the screen and left with her in the back of the car. I saved that clip too, not to share, just to remember. It marked the moment the saga truly ended. A month later, the HOA held its long-overdue leadership election. Karen's name wasn't even on the ballot. Greg was elected president by a landslide, and one of the first things he did was rewrite the HOA charter to include clauses preventing unilateral property access and mandating background checks for board members. He invited me to contribute language regarding research zones and special use structures. I helped draft it over coffee at the local library. No drama, no yelling, just community members actually working together for once. The new HOA even partnered with a regional science program to host a seasonal event on my property. We called it Snake Awareness Day. It was half science fair, half family festival. We had booths with snake facts, conservation games, and even a photo station where kids could take pictures with a non-venomous python draped around their shoulders. One booth sold cookies shaped like coiled snakes, and another gave out stickers that said scales not scandals. I walked around quietly, answering questions, watching neighbors who once avoided my property now cheerfully asking how they could support my work. It felt surreal, like the entire neighborhood had been through a transformation alongside the reptiles they once feared. Karen eventually moved. Word got around that she sold her house at a loss, citing stress and neighborhood hostility. The truth was, she couldn't stand being invisible. Her power was gone, her audience had vanished, and her name was now synonymous with public embarrassment. Even her cousin Dave had stopped showing up. When her house finally emptied, I took a quiet walk past it one evening. The porch light was off, the garden overgrown. It was strange how silence could be the loudest form of victory. I never wanted any of this. I hadn't asked to be the symbol of resistance against HOA tyranny or the accidental face of reptile right. But I wasn't sorry for what happened either. It proved something I always believed, that reason, when backed by truth and persistence, can outlast even the loudest noise. My shed wasn't just a structure. It was a lifeline for an entire ecosystem. And now, it was a landmark for something even bigger. A story of resilience. A quiet man with a loud purpose. And a shed full of snakes that outlasted the hiss of a very different kind.